She appeared in his life like morning light through a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. But some angels carry messages from the dead. David walked into the coffee shop at exactly 7:15 a.m., just like he did every morning. The bell above the door made the same soft chime, and he breathed in the familiar smell of fresh coffee beans. Everything was exactly where it should be. The barista behind the counter gave him a small nod. She already knew his order by heart. "The usual?" she asked, reaching for a medium cup. "Black coffee, no sugar," David replied, pulling out his wallet. He always had the exact change ready, $3.50. No waiting, no small talk, no surprises. David had been coming to this place for 2 years now, ever since his life had fallen apart. Back then he needed something steady, something he could count on. The coffee shop became his anchor. Same time, same table, same routine. It made him feel safe in a world that had proven it could change without warning. He walked to his corner table by the window. The morning light filtered through the glass, casting familiar shadows across the wooden surface. David sat down and opened his newspaper, folding it exactly in half. He always started with the business section. Numbers made sense. Stock prices went up or down for reasons you could understand. Unlike people, the coffee shop buzzed with its usual morning crowd. Office workers grabbed drinks to go. Students hunched over laptops with tired eyes. Everyone moved in their own little bubble, and David liked it that way. No one bothered him here. No one asked how he was doing or why he looked so tired. He could just exist without explaining himself. David had learned to appreciate silence after his divorce 3 years ago. Rachel had always filled their house with noise. Music, phone calls with friends, the television always playing something. She said the quiet made her nervous. But David discovered that quiet was peaceful. Quiet was predictable. Quiet never lied to you or packed its bags and left when things got hard. He sipped his coffee and turned to the sports page. The local baseball team had lost again. David didn't really care about sports, but reading about wins and losses felt safer than reading about politics or world events. Those stories reminded him too much of his own life. How quickly things could go wrong. How people could hurt each other without even trying. The bell chimed again as someone new walked in. David didn't look up. He had trained himself not to be curious about strangers. Curiosity led to conversations, and conversations led to connections, and connections led to disappointment. He had learned this lesson the hard way, but then something strange happened. Without any sound of footsteps or the scraping of a chair being pulled out, someone was sitting across from him. Just like that, as if she had always been there. David looked up from his newspaper, startled. A woman sat in the chair opposite him, smiling like they were old friends meeting for their weekly catch-up. She had kind eyes and wore a simple blue sweater. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She looked completely comfortable, as if this table belonged to both of them. "Hello," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "I hope you don't mind me sitting here. All the other tables are taken." David glanced around the coffee shop. At least 5 empty tables were scattered around the room. His first instinct was to point this out, to reclaim his space and his solitude. But something about her smile stopped him. It wasn't pushy or fake. It was genuine in a way that caught him off guard. No, that's fine," he heard himself saying. She extended her hand across the table. "I'm Maya." "David," he replied, shaking her hand briefly. Her grip was firm but not aggressive. Confident but not overwhelming. Maya glanced at the thick book lying next to his newspaper. It was a philosophy text about human nature and society. David had chosen it specifically because it looked boring enough to discourage anyone from starting a conversation about it. "Interesting choice," Maya said, nodding toward the book. "What do you think of his argument about authentic living?" David blinked. Most people saw the book's intimidating title and immediately looked away. But Maya was asking about one of the main themes, as if she had actually read it. "You know this book?" David asked. "I've read some of his work," Maya replied. "I find it fascinating how he writes about the masks we wear, how we build these careful versions of ourselves to show the world. But sometimes we forget who we really are underneath." David felt something shift inside his chest, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. This woman, this stranger, was talking about exactly what he thought about late at night, when sleep wouldn't come. The way he had become so focused on protecting himself that he wasn't sure who he was protecting anymore. It's an interesting perspective," David said carefully. Maya smiled again, and David noticed how it reached her eyes. I think the scariest part is when we realize we've been hiding from ourselves as much as from other people. But maybe that's also when the real work begins. David stared at her. How could she know exactly what he needed to hear? How could a complete stranger see through all his careful defenses with just a few words? Do you come here often? David asked, trying to regain his balance in the conversation. Sometimes, Maya replied. I like places where people can just be themselves. No pressure, no expectations, just present. She picked up the menu and studied it thoughtfully. What do you recommend? David found himself talking about the different coffee blends, the pastries that were fresh in the morning, the quiet corner where the Wi-Fi worked best for reading. He realized he was sharing details about this place that he had never told anyone, small things that mattered to him. The way the morning light hit the window just right. How the barista always remembered to leave extra napkins because she noticed he was neat about keeping his table clean. As he talked, Maya listened with complete attention. She didn't check her phone or look around the room. She focused on his words as if they were the most important thing she could be hearing right then. David couldn't remember the last time someone had listened to him like that. When Maya finally ordered a simple coffee with cream, David found himself asking, "What kind of work do you do?" I help people, she said simply, when they're ready to help themselves. It was a vague answer, but something about the way she said it made David not want to push for details. Instead, he found himself relaxing in his chair, letting his newspaper stay folded, allowing this unexpected conversation to happen. For the first time in years, his carefully planned morning routine had been interrupted, and somehow, surprisingly, the world had not ended. In fact, sitting across from Maya, watching her genuine smile and listening to her thoughtful words, David felt something he had almost forgotten existed. He felt curious about another person, and for just a moment that felt like the most natural thing in the world. The coffee shop continued its familiar hum around them, but at their little table by the window, something new had quietly begun. 3 days passed before Maya appeared again. David found himself checking the coffee shop entrance more often than usual, though he told himself it was just habit. When she finally walked in on Friday morning, he felt a small flutter of relief that surprised him. She slid into the same chair across from him, carrying a worn leather bag and that same gentle smile. This time she had brought her own book. David noticed it was a collection of short stories by an author he had never heard of. Good morning, Maya said, settling into her seat like she belonged there. How's the philosophy coming along? David looked down at his book, realizing he had been reading the same page for 10 minutes. Slowly, he admitted. Some days the words just don't seem to stick. Maybe that's okay, Maya replied. Sometimes we need to let ideas sit with us for a while before they make sense. There was something comforting about the way she said it. No judgment, no pressure to be smarter or faster or better, just acceptance that learning took time. Over the next 2 weeks, Maya began showing up at the coffee shop regularly. Not every day, but often enough that David started expecting her. She never asked if she could sit with him. She just appeared, smiled, and somehow made the space feel less lonely. Their conversation started small. Maya would comment on something she noticed. The way the barista hummed while making drinks. How the morning light changed as autumn deepened. Little observations that David had noticed too, but never shared with anyone. You pay attention to details, Maya said one Tuesday morning, stirring cream into her coffee. I like that about you. David felt warmth spread through his chest. When was the last time someone had complimented something about his personality, rather than his work or achievements? Gradually, their talks grew deeper. Maya had a gift for asking questions that slipped past David's usual walls. Not pushy questions, but gentle ones that felt safe to answer. What do you do when you're not reading heavy philosophy books? She asked one morning. David almost gave his standard response about work and staying busy, but something about Maya's patient expression made him pause. I used to play piano, he said instead, surprising himself. Haven't touched the keys in years, though. What kind of music did you play? Nothing special, just songs that felt peaceful. Classical pieces, some jazz. I was never very good at it. Maya leaned forward slightly. What made you stop? David's throat tightened. The honest answer was that his ex-wife Rachel had complained about the noise, said it gave her headaches when she was trying to work. Eventually, he had just stopped playing to keep the peace. But saying that out loud felt too raw, too revealing. Life got busy, he said instead. Maya nodded, but her eyes suggested she heard the deeper truth he wasn't ready to share. The following week, Maya mentioned she had grown up in a house full of music. Her mother had sung lullabies in 3 different languages. Her father had played guitar on the front porch every evening after dinner. "It sounds wonderful," David said, and meant it. "It was," Maya replied, "but it also made me feel invisible sometimes. Everyone was so talented, so vibrant. I learned to just listen and watch, to notice what people needed before they asked for it." David understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit, the sense of being on the outside, observing life rather than fully living it. Maybe listening is a talent too, he found himself saying. Maya's smile brightened. Maybe it is. Their conversations began to reveal small pieces of their inner worlds. Maya talked about feeling like she moved through life trying to fix things for other people, sometimes forgetting to take care of herself. David shared his struggle with trusting people after his marriage ended badly. "Trust is strange," Maya said thoughtfully. "We think it's about other people, but really it's about whether we trust ourselves to handle whatever happens." David had never thought about it that way, but it made sense. His fear wasn't really about other people hurting him again. It was about whether he was strong enough to survive another disappointment. One morning, David arrived at the coffee shop to find Maya already there, reading quietly. She looked up as he approached their usual table. "I ordered your coffee," she said, pushing a cup toward him. "Black, no sugar." David sat down, touched by the small gesture. "How did you know I'd be here?" "Lucky guess," Maya replied. But there was something playful in her expression that suggested it was more than luck. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both reading their books. David realized this was the first time in years that he had shared quiet space with another person, without feeling anxious or watched. Maya's presence was like a warm blanket, comforting without being overwhelming. "Can I ask you something?" David said eventually. Maya closed her book and gave him her full attention. "Why do you keep coming here? I mean, why do you choose to sit with me?" Maya was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. "Because you seem like someone with interesting thoughts who's forgotten how to share them," she said finally. "And because loneliness looks different on everyone, but I recognize it when I see it." David felt exposed and understood at the same time. Most people looked at his life from the outside and saw success. Good job, nice apartment, financial stability. They didn't see the emptiness, the way he went days without having a real conversation with anyone. "I wasn't always like this," David said quietly. "I used to be more open, I guess. What changed?" David traced the rim of his coffee cup with his finger. "I got hurt, made some bad choices about who to trust. Decided it was easier to just not." "Easier," Maya repeated. But not better, it wasn't a question. She could see right through his carefully constructed logic. "No," David admitted. "Not better." That afternoon, something unexpected happened. David was walking home from work when he passed a music store. Without thinking, he stopped and stared at the piano visible through the window. His fingers twitched slightly, remembering the feel of keys beneath them. He stood there for 10 minutes before walking away, but something had shifted. For the first time in 3 years, he had allowed himself to remember what it felt like to create something beautiful. The next morning, Maya was waiting at their table with her usual smile. "You look different today," she observed. David couldn't explain it, but he felt different too, like a door inside him had cracked open just enough to let in a thin stream of light. 2 months had passed since Maya first appeared in David's carefully ordered world. Their morning meetings had become the highlight of his days, though he wouldn't admit that to himself yet. He still called them coincidences, these regular encounters that had begun to reshape his routine in small but meaningful ways. On a crisp October morning, Maya surprised him with an unusual suggestion. "There's something I'd like to show you," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup for warmth. "If you're interested." David looked up from his newspaper, curious. Maya had never suggested they meet anywhere else besides the coffee shop. Their friendship, if he could call it that, had existed entirely within these familiar walls. "What kind of something?" he asked. "A place downtown. It's hard to explain, but I think you'd find it interesting." There was something different about Maya today. She seemed more purposeful, like she had been planning this moment for a while. David felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. "Okay," he heard himself saying. When? This afternoon? After your work? David nodded before he could talk himself out of it. They agreed to meet at 5 o'clock near the old courthouse downtown. All day at work, David found himself distracted. He kept checking the clock, wondering what Maya wanted to show him. His colleague Jennifer noticed his restlessness during their afternoon meeting. "You seem different lately," she commented as they walked back to their desks. "More, I don't know, present somehow." David was surprised. He hadn't realized that his inner changes were visible to others. But maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe he was more present these days, less lost in his own protective thoughts. At exactly 5 o'clock, David found Maya waiting by the courthouse steps. She wore a long coat and carried a small bag over her shoulder. When she saw him, her face lit up with that familiar warm smile. "Ready for a little adventure?" she asked. They walked 3 blocks to a narrow building sandwiched between a bookstore and a flower shop. David had passed this street many times but never noticed the small gallery tucked between the larger businesses. A simple sign read, "Transformations Local Artists Explore Change." "An art gallery?" David said, feeling uncertain. He couldn't remember the last time he had looked at art that wasn't hanging in a doctor's waiting room. "Just trust me," Maya said gently, pushing open the glass door. Inside, the gallery was quiet and warm. Soft lighting illuminated paintings and sculptures arranged throughout the space. Only a few other visitors wandered slowly from piece to piece, their voices hushed and respectful. Maya led him to the first painting, a large canvas covered in layers of different colors. From far away, it looked like abstract swirls of paint, but as David stepped closer, he began to see shapes emerging from the chaos. A face here, a hand there, figures that seemed to be breaking free from something that had been holding them back. "The artist calls this one Becoming," Maya said softly. She painted over the same canvas dozens of times, letting each layer show through the next one. David stared at the painting, feeling something stir inside his chest. The layered figures reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite name what. They moved slowly through the gallery together. Each piece seemed to deal with transformation in a different way. One sculpture showed a cocoon made of metal and glass, with delicate butterfly wings visible inside waiting to emerge. Another painting depicted a tree growing through the cracks of a concrete wall, its roots breaking apart the hard surface to reach the soil beneath. But it was the final piece that stopped David. Completely, the painting showed a figure sitting alone in what looked like a protective shell or cocoon. The shell was beautiful, made of intricate patterns and soft colors, but it was also clearly a prison. Around the figure, you could see hints of a larger world. Other people, sunshine, flowers, music notes floating in the air. All the life that existed beyond the safety of the shell. At the bottom of the shell, there was a small crack, just tiny, barely visible. But through it, a single beam of light was reaching the figure inside. David stood in front of this painting for a long time, not speaking. Maya waited beside him patiently, not explaining or interpreting, just present while he experienced his own recognition. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I built myself a shell." Maya nodded but didn't say anything. "After my marriage ended, after Rachel left, I thought I was protecting myself. I thought I was being smart, careful. But really, I was just hiding." David felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. He hadn't cried in 3 years, hadn't allowed himself to feel this deeply about anything. "The shell kept me safe," he continued, still staring at the painting, "but it also kept everything else out. All the good things, too." Maya placed a gentle hand on his arm. "What do you see in that crack of light?" David looked more closely at the painting. In the beam of light, he could make out tiny images. A piano keyboard, people talking and laughing, a hand reaching out in friendship. All the things he had given up in the name of protecting himself. "Possibility," David said finally. "I see possibility." They left the gallery as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. David felt raw and exposed, like his emotions were too close to the surface, but he also felt more awake than he had in years. "Thank you," he said as they walked slowly down the street, "for showing me that." "You were ready to see it," Maya replied. "I just provided the mirror." That night, David did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He called his sister Lisa. They had barely spoken since their father's funeral, when grief and old family tensions had created a wall between them. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. "David?" Lisa's voice was surprised. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," David said, realizing he meant it more than he had in a long time. I wanted to talk to you. To hear your voice." The conversation was awkward at first. They stumbled over words, unsure how to bridge the gap that time and hurt had created. But slowly, carefully, they began to remember how to be brother and sister again. "I've missed you," Lisa said near the end of their call. "I didn't know how to reach out after everything that happened." "Me too," David admitted. "I think I forgot how to let people in." "Maybe we can remember together," Lisa suggested gently. After they hung up, David sat in his quiet apartment feeling different. The silence that had once felt protective now seemed less necessary. He looked at his piano in the corner, covered with a sheet and used as a table for mail and magazines. For the first time in years, he walked over and lifted the sheet. He pressed one key, then another. The sound filled his apartment with something he had almost forgotten existed. The next morning at the coffee shop, Maya was waiting with her usual smile, but David thought he saw something new in her expression. Not satisfaction exactly, but a quiet joy, as if she had witnessed something beautiful happening. "How are you feeling?" she asked as he sat down. David considered the question seriously. "Different," he said finally. "Scared, but different. Like maybe being scared isn't the worst thing anymore." Maya's smile deepened, and David realized that somehow, without him noticing, the crack in his protective shell had begun to widen, letting in more light with each passing day. David's world had begun to feel different ever since the visit to the art gallery. Colors seemed brighter, conversations felt easier, and he found himself smiling at strangers on the street. His sister Lisa had started calling him once a week, and their talks were becoming more natural with each conversation. He had even bought sheet music and started playing piano again, filling his apartment with melodies that chased away the persistent silence. But as David grew more comfortable with change, he began to notice strange things about Maya that didn't quite add up. It started small. One morning, Maya mentioned loving the old diner that used to be on 5th Street, describing their famous apple pie in perfect detail. David knew that diner well. It had been his favorite place as a teenager, but it had closed down 15 years ago, long before Maya could have been old enough to eat there. When David mentioned this, Maya paused for just a moment, then smiled and said, "Oh, I must be thinking of a different place. Another time." She recommended a book that she claimed had changed her life in college. David looked it up later and discovered it had only been published 2 years ago. When he brought it up the next day, Maya laughed it off as a mistake, but David caught something in her eyes. A flicker of something that looked almost like sadness. The coincidences kept piling up. Maya always seemed to arrive at the coffee shop just when David needed her most. On days when work was particularly stressful, she would appear with exactly the right words to calm his mind. When he was struggling with a difficult conversation with his sister, Maya would share a story that gave him the perspective he needed. Most puzzling of all, Maya seemed to know things about David that he had never told her. She mentioned that he probably missed his grandmother's garden, even though he had never spoken about his grandmother. She suggested he might like jazz piano, specifically mentioning an artist that had been his secret favorite for years. Instead of feeling suspicious or worried, David found himself drawn deeper into the mystery. Maya's knowledge felt less like intrusion and more like recognition, as if she could see parts of him that he had forgotten existed. One afternoon in late November, they were talking about childhood memories. David was sharing a story about learning to ride his first bicycle, when Maya said something that stopped him. "Cold, your grandmother Rose must have been so proud when you finally made it, all the way around the block without falling." David's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. He stared at Maya, his heart suddenly beating faster. "I never told you my grandmother's name," he said quietly. Maya's expression changed. The easy smile faded, replaced by something more complex. She looked down at her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "No," she said softly. "You didn't. I never told you about learning to ride my bike around her block either." Maya was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the coffee shop continued its normal rhythm. But at their table, something important was happening. "How do you know these things about me?" David asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Maya looked up at him and David saw tears gathering in her eyes. In all their conversations, he had never seen her cry. Because someone who loved you very much told me about them, Maya said finally. David felt the world tilt slightly. What do you mean? Maya took a deep breath as if gathering courage for something she had been avoiding. I need to tell you about my best friend, she began. Her name was Rachel. The name hit David like a physical blow. Rachel, his ex-wife. The woman who had left him 3 years ago, taking with her not just her belongings but his faith in love, trust, and connection. Rachel told you about me? David whispered. Maya nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She talked about you all the time. Even after the divorce, especially after the divorce. She never stopped caring about you, David. She never stopped worrying about how you were doing. David's mind raced. But why would she? We haven't spoken since the papers were signed. Because she knew you, Maya said. She knew that when you got hurt, you would disappear. You would build walls and hide behind them. She was terrified that you would spend the rest of your life alone, punishing yourself for something that wasn't entirely your fault. David felt like he was drowning. The divorce was my fault. I wasn't good enough for her. I couldn't give her what she needed. That's not what she told me, Maya said firmly. Rachel said you were two good people who wanted different things. She said the marriage failing didn't mean either of you were failures as human beings. Maya reached across the table and took David's hand. Her touch was warm and steady. Rachel made me promise something before she died. Maya continued, her voice breaking slightly on the word, died. Died? David felt the air leave his lungs. Rachel is dead? Maya nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she found her voice again, it was barely above a whisper. Car accident. 6 months ago, she was driving home from her job at the animal shelter when someone ran a red light. David sat in stunned silence. Rachel was gone. The woman he had once loved. The woman he had married believing they would grow old together. The woman whose leaving had broken something inside him that he thought could never be repaired. She was gone forever. She made me promise to find you, Maya continued, to make sure you were okay, to help you remember that you deserve love and connection, even if it couldn't be with her. David's vision blurred with tears. So all of this? Our friendship? It was just you keeping a promise to a dead woman? No, Maya said quickly, squeezing his hand. It started that way, yes. But David, getting to know you, watching you slowly come back to life, seeing you rediscover joy and connection, that became real. That became important to me for my own reasons. David pulled his hand away, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. Grief for Rachel, confusion about Maya's motives, anger at being deceived, and underneath it all, a strange kind of relief. She really worried about me? He asked. Every day, Maya confirmed. She used to say that breaking up with you was the hardest thing she had ever done. But staying would have been unfair to both of you. She said you both deserved to find happiness. Just not with each other. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring who might see him crying in the middle of a coffee shop. I hated her for leaving, he admitted. I convinced myself that she was selfish, that she gave up too easily. She knew you would think that, Maya said. She hoped that someday you would understand that loving someone sometimes means letting them go to find what they really need. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, David looked up at Maya. What happens now? He asked. Maya smiled through her tears. Now you get to decide who you want to be with the rest of your life. Rachel's gone, but her love for you, her belief in your capacity for happiness, that's still here. That's real. David felt something shift inside him. The anger and hurt he had carried for 3 years began to transform into something else. Gratitude, maybe, and a strange kind of peace. For the first time since their marriage ended, David allowed himself to remember the good parts of loving Rachel. And for the first time in his life, he began to understand that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to become who they're meant to be. The weeks following Maya's revelation felt like living in a completely different world. David found himself grieving for Rachel in a way he had never allowed himself to before. Not just for their marriage or the hurt of their divorce, but for the woman herself. The woman who had loved animals enough to work at a shelter. The woman who had worried about him even after their relationship ended. The woman who was now gone forever. He cried for 3 days straight, real tears. Not the angry, bitter tears he had shed during their divorce, but deep, cleansing sobs that seemed to wash away years of resentment and self-blame. Maya stayed close during this time, appearing at the coffee shop each morning with tissues and patience, never trying to fix his pain but simply witnessing it with quiet compassion. "I wasted so much time being angry," David said one morning, his voice hoarse from crying. "I could have called her. I could have tried to understand why she left instead of just deciding she was wrong." "You did what you needed to do to survive," Maya replied gently. Rachel understood that. She never expected you to handle it perfectly. As December arrived and the first snow began to fall, David noticed something changing in Maya. She seemed lighter somehow, as if telling him the truth had lifted a weight from her shoulders. But there was also a quality of distance that hadn't been there before, as if she was slowly pulling back from their daily meetings. She still came to the coffee shop, but not every day. Sometimes she would miss 2 or 3 days in a row, leaving David to drink his coffee alone and wonder where she was. When he asked, she would smile and say she had other people to help, other promises to keep. "Are you going to disappear now?" David asked one morning in mid-December. Snow was falling outside the window, covering the world in clean white silence. Maya looked at him with surprise. "What makes you think that?" "You feel different," David said honestly. "Like you're already half gone." Maya was quiet for a long time, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Finally, she spoke. "Rachel asked me to help you remember who you were before the pain changed you. I think that's starting to happen." David knew she was right. Over the past month, he had begun to feel like himself again. Not the careful, controlled version of himself that he had become after the divorce, but the person he had been before. Someone who took chances. Someone who reached out to others. Someone who believed that connection was worth the risk of getting hurt. He had been playing piano almost every evening, filling his apartment with music for the first time in years. He had started having dinner with his sister Lisa once a week, rebuilding their relationship slowly but steadily. He had even begun talking to his coworkers at the office, discovering that some of them were actually interesting people with stories worth hearing. Most importantly, he had started to believe that he deserved happiness, not just the absence of pain but real joy, the kind that came from letting people into your life and trusting that most of them would be kind. "What will you do now?" David asked Maya. "Now that Rachel's promise is kept?" Maya smiled, but there was sadness in it. There are other people who need help remembering who they are. Other promises to keep. David felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy. He had grown so used to being the focus of Maya's attention, the recipient of her gentle wisdom. The thought of her moving on to help someone else felt like another kind of loss. But then he realized something that surprised him. He wasn't desperate at the thought of losing Maya's support. Sad, yes, but not desperate. He had learned to stand on his own again. He had rediscovered his own strength. "Will I see you again?" he asked. "Maybe," Maya said, "but probably not in the same way. You don't need me anymore, David. Not the way you did when we first met." She was right, and they both knew it. The broken man who had sat alone in this coffee shop for 2 years, hiding behind his newspaper and his carefully controlled routine, was gone. In his place was someone who was learning to embrace uncertainty, to welcome surprise, to trust in the possibility of good things happening. On the last day of December, Maya appeared at the coffee shop one final time. She looked different somehow, more ethereal, as if she was already becoming a memory. "I have something for you," she said. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a small wrapped package and placed it on the table between them. David opened it carefully to find a photograph. It showed Rachel at the animal shelter, kneeling next to a large golden retriever, both of them smiling at the camera. Rachel looked happy and peaceful, exactly as David remembered her at her best. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in Rachel's familiar handwriting, "For David, who taught me that love doesn't always mean staying together. Thank you for the good years. Be happy." David felt tears starting again, but they were different tears now. Grateful tears. Healing tears. "She wrote that the week before she died," Maya said softly. "She was going to send it to you, but she wasn't sure if you were ready to receive it." "I am now," David said, holding the photograph carefully. "Thank you for waiting until I was ready." Maya stood up from the table and gathered her things. "Take care of yourself, David. Let people love you. You deserve all the good things this world has to offer." "Maya, wait," David said as she turned to leave. "I never asked." "How did you and Rachel meet? How long were you friends?" Maya paused at the door and looked back at him with that familiar, mysterious smile. "We met when she needed someone to listen," Maya said. "Just like you did." And then she was gone, stepping out into the swirling snow and disappearing around the corner. David watched through the window until he couldn't see her anymore, then sat back down and looked at the photograph of Rachel. For the first time in years, thinking about his ex-wife didn't bring anger or bitterness. Instead, he felt a deep gratitude for the love they had shared, even if it hadn't lasted forever. He understood now that some people come into your life to stay, and others come to teach you something important before moving on. Both kinds of love were valuable. Both kinds were real. David finished his coffee and stood up to leave. As he walked toward the door, he paused to look back at the table where he and Maya had shared so many conversations. The chair across from him was empty now, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt full of possibility. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily, covering the streets in a blanket of fresh white. David pulled his coat tighter and began walking home, but instead of taking his usual direct route, he decided to take the long way. He wanted to see what else was out there in the world, what other surprises might be waiting for him. As he walked, David found himself humming a melody he hadn't thought of in years. One of the songs he used to play on piano, back when music was a regular part of his life. Tomorrow he decided he would learn a new song, something hopeful, something that celebrated beginnings rather than endings. Behind him, if he had looked back, David might have seen a figure standing in the swirling snow, smiling as she watched him walk confidently into his new life. But David didn't look back. He had learned that the most beautiful moments happen when you're brave enough to keep moving forward, trusting that every step takes you closer to the person you're meant to become. The snow continued to fall, covering the old footprints and making space for new ones to be made.